Is your podcast optimized for discovery? Are listeners able to find your show? If you're struggling to find new listeners for your podcast, then that is the first question that you need to ask yourself. And if you're struggling to find answers, then this episode is for you. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you're new here and you don't know me, then I'm a blogger, podcaster, and affiliate marketer. I run the show, The Podcasting University, which is all about simple, practical, and implementable podcasting tips. You'll be able to find links to the podcast in the description box below. You can go ahead and listen to the podcast there. And if you're new to podcasting and you want to get started with your own podcast, then you might want to join my free course on how to start a podcast in 10 days. You'll be able to join the free course on thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide. You'll be able to find the link in the description box below. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on to today's episode. With over 2 million podcasts out there, getting discovered is one of the biggest challenges that podcasters face today. You may have the most amazing show that you ever produced, but if your listeners aren't able to find you, then what's the point of all of the effort that you've put into creating that show? I come across so many podcasters who've been doing amazing shows for months and sometimes even years, but their listenership is minimal. And almost always the issue lies in lack of discoverability. If you're in the same boat, struggling to find new listeners for your podcast, then this episode is for you. I'll be sharing the 3 most important ways of getting your podcast discovered. So you might want to listen to the entire episode, because even the third tip that I'm going to share might benefit your podcast and get you some new listeners. But first, it is important to understand that when it comes to getting discovered, irrespective of you're into podcasting, blogging, vlogging, YouTube, or whatever it is, search engines are your best friend. And when it comes to podcasting, it can be Google, YouTube, or any of the other podcast players. Optimizing for search is critical to get your podcast show up on the people who are searching for new podcasts. And contrary to what people think, social media is not where you're going to find new listeners. They contribute very little to a podcast's growth. Instead, what social media does is they'll help you in engaging with your listeners. But everybody keeps talking about using social media or putting your podcast on social media to grow your podcast. And most beginners would listen to that advice and put all of their energy into doing the same, and in doing that, what happens is they ignore all of the real discovery methods. So what I'm going to talk about is the 3 most ignored podcast discovery methods which will help you gain 80% of your new listeners. So let's get started. Number 1, search engine optimization, or SEO. Now, search discovery is the second largest source of new listenership, but most people ignore it. You might want to optimize your episodes and your podcast for search. You would want to use relevant keywords in the title, in the description, in the name of the podcast, in your show notes, and wherever possible. And if you're posting your podcast to YouTube, then understand that YouTube has the strongest search and discovery feature in itself. And if your episodes don't show up for the relevant keywords on this search, then they will never be found. And when it comes to podcast listening apps, podcasts are searched with specific keywords. People search podcasts with keywords that they are looking answers for. And if your podcast doesn't show up for these keywords relevant to your niche, then your podcast will never be found by the new listeners. You need to include keywords and other related keyword phrases that your listeners are likely to be searching for within your podcast's metadata. So, for example, if your podcast is something that covers social media marketing tips, then be sure to include relevant keywords like social media marketing, Facebook ads, Instagram strategy, or LinkedIn strategy, etc. within your title's description and even the podcast name. Because this is what people will be searching for on these different podcast listening apps, on Google, or even on YouTube. And when they do that, your podcast will show up for these searches. Using the right keywords helps the search algorithms match your content to a specific keyword that people are searching for. And hence, they will show your podcast to these prospective listeners. That way, you will get a lot of new listeners. Number 2, a podcast website. Now, a podcast website helps in 2 different ways. One is to getting ranked on Google and in turn getting new listeners. And number two is to build an email list that helps in repeat listenership. So don't discount a website, even if it is a very basic one. Put together a very simple website. You have a lot of simple tools that you can use and install or create a good, beautiful looking simple website for your podcast on WordPress. I have a different blog post on my blog. You'll be able to find it on the podcastinguniversity.com, where I show you how to put together a very simple website for your podcast. Go ahead and put together a good website for your podcast. And once you've done that, publish all of your podcast episodes there. Then optimize the podcast episode posts or the show notes for relevant keywords, the keywords that are relevant to that particular episode and relevant to the niche for your podcast. Now, a secret tip is to use long tail keywords. Now, long tail keywords are keywords that have more than 3 words in it. It will be slightly longer. These long tail keywords will have lower search volume, but at the same time low competition as well. For example, a keyword like that of lose weight versus lose weight with intermittent fasting. Now, lose weight with intermittent fasting is a more narrower search, which means that the number of people searching for it might be low, but at the same time, the competition for websites that are optimized for that particular keyword will also be low. So optimize your podcast episode show notes for long tail keywords. If you don't know how to find long tail keywords, and you can use a tool like that of Ubersuggest, which is a very simple tool. It is free. You can even go for the pro version, but the free option is more than enough. You will be able to use this tool and search for keywords that are long tail keywords and then optimize your podcast using these keywords. Now, the truth is that we are not experts in SEO. And when it comes to optimizing blog posts or podcast episodes, SEO can be extremely overwhelming. We don't know what are the things that we need to do in order to optimize our blog posts for SEO, or for that matter, podcast episodes for SEO. All of this can be taken care of by another simple tool that I absolutely recommend. It is called as RankMath. It's a free tool. Again, they also have a premium version, but you don't need the premium version. You can easily do everything using the free option itself. Install this plugin on your WordPress blog and use it to optimize your posts. The RankMath tool gives you a checklist, which is very easy. You'll be able to go through the checklist and see if your blog post is optimized for those keywords. And just following that checklist will ensure that you're optimizing your blog post for those particular keywords. Now remember that ranking on Google is equal to new listeners. I rank for most of my podcast episodes on Google Snippets. Google Snippets are the small highlights that show up on Google when you're searching for a particular term. I'm able to rank my podcast episodes on that Google Snippets, and you'll be able to get quite a good number of people clicking over to your website. And when they come over to my website, they listen to my podcast. And I'm able to use this for some good keywords with search volume of around 100 to 200. Now, 100 to 200 might appear a little low in terms of the volume, but it is still good enough to build listenership for your podcast. So build a podcast website, put your podcast episodes out there, optimize your blog posts for search, and you'll be able to get a lot of new listeners for your podcast. Number 3, utilizing the power of recommendations. Now, a happy listener can bring in 2 more listeners. That's right. Focus on using recommendations from listeners, other podcasters, influencers. All of these can get you new listeners. But the best recommendation is from your existing listeners. Somebody who's already listened to your podcast, like it, and recommend it to their friends, social media circles are the people who can get you the best and long-term listeners for your podcast. So encourage your existing listeners to recommend your show to their social media circles, to their family, to their friends. Incentivize them to do it. Now, what I usually do is I give out handouts, templates, free consultations to people who are recommending my show to their friends. Now, this is the most effective way and the best way of building your audience, because when your existing listeners are incentivized, they go ahead and recommend your podcast to others because they obviously love your podcast, and on top of that they are being incentivized to recommend people. So they go ahead and recommend your podcast to their friends, social media circles, and thereby you'll be able to get a lot of new listeners. So you might want to give it a try and you'll be surprised at the way the listenership builds up. And the fourth one is optimizing your submission to podcast directories. Now, while search engines will help you find listeners organically, podcast directories allow you to proactively get discovered. All of those platforms or directories like that of iTunes, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, these are all podcast directories where you can submit your podcast. So one, you might want to ensure that you're submitting your podcast to all of these directories. Two, ensure that you're optimizing your show for these podcast directories so that when people are browsing the categories on these podcast directories, they are able to come across your show, find your show, and thereby become listeners of your show. I'll be discussing this in a little more detail in another episode of mine. So stay tuned. You might want to subscribe to this podcast and click the bell notification so that you stay updated whenever I release that episode. But there I'll be discussing more on how to optimize your podcast for podcast directories. But optimize your podcast for podcast directories, and that will help you get a lot of new listeners for your podcast. Now, as a closing thought, there are a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind. First, focus on your website over social media. I know that this might sound a little counterintuitive because there are a lot of people who keep recommending social media to promote your podcast, but platforms like Instagram and Twitter, they have very limited search capabilities. Most people discover new podcasts through searches and not endlessly scrolling on a social media platform like that of Instagram. Instead of focusing all of your time on these social media channels, put the time and effort into building a website for your podcast and optimize it from a search engine perspective rather than chasing all of those vanity metrics on Instagram like the follower counts and all of that. That is not going to help you build your listeners. And secondly, YouTube is entering the podcast game. And I believe search and discovery of podcasts will significantly evolve in the coming years, primarily because YouTube has an extremely strong search and discovery capability in itself. And if your podcast is listed on YouTube, then the possibility of your podcast being shown to people who are searching with specific keywords is much more. And on top of that, YouTube has a much better way of recommending the right content to their users. So that way, the possibility of your podcast showing up in front of a lot of the people who are using YouTube is much more if you optimize it for YouTube. So being optimized for today and for the future is the key to getting new listeners and succeeding with your podcast. Let me know your thoughts about these tips that I shared in today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then do click the thumbs up button below because that will help other users find this video and benefit from it. And if you're new to this channel, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification so that you stay updated with all of the latest videos that I am releasing. I release a video every Friday, so you might want to come back the next Friday for my latest video. That is all that I have for this video. If you have any questions, you can drop them in the comment section below and I respond to all of the comments that I get. And if you have a question that cannot be answered in the comment, I'll go ahead and create a video for you. That is all that I have for today's video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting discussion around podcasting. Until then, keep watching and you have a wonderful rest of the week.